Welcome to Salt of the Earth Farm Stories, where the heart of farming comes alive. Each week, host Darren Grigg will dive into the rich tapestry of farm life, sharing tales of hard work, laughter, and the incredible people who bring our food to the table. So grab your boots as we celebrate the stories that connect us to the land and each other.
I'm your host, Darren Grigg. Today, we're diving into the remarkable life of John McAuley, born in 1929, who spent his early years battling the harsh isolation of South Australia's outback. From soldier settler blocks to dust storms that buried houses, John's memory takes us back to the days when life was tough and survival was a full-time job. We'll hear about the Depression years, the bombing of Darwin, and some wild tales of breaking in horses and lassoing petrol drums out of water. And, as John puts it, back then, wearing gloves was being a pansy of the highest order. Stick around, this one's a ride. Good morning, John. It's good to finally meet you.
I welcome you. It's interesting. Thank you.
Well, we sit here in the Barossa Valley today, and we're going to look back over just a few years of your life. Can you tell me roughly how many years are we talking, and when were you born?
Well, I was born in 1929, and things were tough.
Does that make you roughly around 95?
I've gone 95 and I'm closer to 6 at the moment, which is starting to realise.
I'll tell you what, mate, you're looking good for nearly 96.
Well, I'm very lucky and very appreciated, and people say, what's your recipe? Well, I can talk about a hard life and living out in the fresh air and horseback and all that, some half my life, and
I do want to talk about that.
a few hangovers here and there, but never sort of knocked myself around, and there were no lollies and no cut your sandwich and away you went. But I suppose I would have to admit, if I call myself a Christian, I'd have to admit that my life is really dependent upon things above.
Yeah, nice.
And I've lost a son at 31 already, and he didn't do anything worse than I've done. So life's in their hands, and I've lost that many friends and so forth that haven't done anything worse than I've done.
Yeah.
So I'd like to recognise that part of it.
Yeah.
And after that I might brag about how lucky I am and what an interesting life I do have.
All right, well, let's go back to 1929. Where were you born?
Well, I was born in the Hawker Hospital, amongst one of the very first ones that were born there, if you could afford it, because otherwise you were a midwife out in a house somewhere or other. I think her name was Miss Ward, or someone was a midwife for those who couldn't manage to go to the new hospital.
So you were one of the lucky ones to be born in the hospital.
Well, yes, exactly. I'd have to admit that.
And your parents were on a station at whereabouts?
Well, I suppose what happened was my great-grandfather left Georgetown and took up a square mile of a block of land at the area called Craddock, south of Hawker. It was the Craddock Plain. It was supposed to be wonderful soil with imagination of settling new settlers in this wonderful new country, covered in natural vegetation, and was allotted 1 square mile. So my grandfather was based at Georgetown at this stage of the game and was adventurous, and he decided to take up one of these square miles. And also his neighbour at Georgetown, who was married to Grandpa's sister, he went up and took up the neighbouring square mile as well. And I'd love to go back to be able to, the opportunities we got today to record history in detail. I've got to the stage where I look for detail. And the detail is, there's a square mile of land, no house, no fencing, no water, no nothing. When they went up there first, they camped under a tree that stood until of recent times, and we've got photos of the tree dead on the ground. And we picked up an ancient sauce bottle that's been identified as about that era on the ground all those years, until recently. Well, they went there in 1877 when that land was chopped up. Well, I suppose then by 29, my grandfather, then when they settled there, married a local lady. And so we became close neighbours then with our own grandparents, plus the original of the Gillicks family, or the second generation. And they went there with money, real money. And the lifestyle was totally different from ours. After the First World War, there was a boom for those who survived. And they did well, and I suppose that put my own parents a bit on the level of building a bit of the construction of the present-day Craddock homestead. And then the reality of, by 29, any bit of a recession we've had here is nothing compared. There was no handouts, no nothing. The real drought set in. They put the plough into the native square mile of country. And little Craddock had 3 churches, 2 hotels, 2 shops, blacksmith shop, a few houses, because it was going to be the mecca of farming on this special Craddock plain. The interesting part is the ploughs were pulled with bullocks.
Right.
And my reaction is, when you think of bullocks today compared with horses, but you have to realise that with no money, bullocks were cheaper, whereas horses were like driving around in Rolls Royces today in cars. We all got cars, but we haven't all got Rolls Royces. Well, those early pioneers couldn't afford horses, but bullocks were something that was sort of cheap and were able to be managed on the country a bit in the beginning. And so that was the communication. And
why were they ploughing?
Well, they were ploughing, sadly, the natural vegetation out of this ground. And of course, they'd ripped up the natural vegetation. The reality of the rainfall set in almost straight away. And I've got photos here and so forth of our house being buried later on because of the dust. Once this land became drought-stricken, the few survivors that out of all that original settlement just went off the land like flies. And then we formed Goyder's line of rainfall, and we're outside that. And even then, the plough has gone and ripped open and exposed this country. And I mean, we talk about climate change, but of course there's climate change. I suppose the point to me is whether man caused it or whether nature does. I mean, the whole of Australia was underwater originally. There was the Ice Age, and we just wiped them off. We might be in one of those ages now, for all I know. But we've also learned that the country needs to be cared for.
Absolutely.
And we made a bad job of it in our ignorance in the early days because we ploughed up the natural vegetation. It was not farming land. The droughts were normal. The rainfall was low.
So there was so much dust because there was no ground cover?
It's interesting. There was a pattern of weather. Twice a week, the wind started in the north, blew all day, turned around to the south by evening, 2 spits of rain. If you hadn't lost your outhouse or the fowl house or something or other, it's a calm day.
Oh, no.
And that's reality.
Yeah.
And that went on for years.
Really?
And it hasn't happened since. Even of latter times, those sort of days might start, but they just fizzle out. But the tearing winds, the howling, rolling dust storms, I wouldn't even be able to see you inside in some of those dust storms. We used to love to go out in the Flinders Ranges that didn't drift, which we had some of that country. As time went on and a few more, our family purchased neighbouring little blocks and so forth and built it up to 10,000 acres.
Yeah. Well, actually, just going back to that photo you were talking about, I've printed it out here. Is that the same photo?
Oh, that's the one I got. Yes.
So
yes.
I'm going to put this to our listeners. I'm going to put this up on the Salt of the Earth Facebook page.
Yes. That's my mother holding me as a baby in 1929.
Right. Now the dust, she's standing on top of the dust that's level with the veranda.
Exactly. And when I left school in 1945, and we had a better run of years in the 50s, and I was still home at Craddock, and I took 45 barrow loads of sand, and I mean barrow loads, not buckets, out of the ceiling. The house was built in stages. First of all, the granddad built a 2-roomed house, stone house, walls that thick. And my father was born in the room off the kitchen. Then he added on 3 more rooms under a double hip roof. And that was one collected the sand because it couldn't drift through. In 1911, another couple of rooms were added on out the front that made it look quite flash. The air circulation through that with the hip roof didn't have much sand left on it, but the ones in the middle, just those 3 rooms in the middle with the 2 lots of hip roofs, where the air circulation couldn't tear through, I took 45 barrow loads of sand out of that alone.
Out of the roof.
And I mean, the thing that aggravated our problem was the house is out on the plain in the middle of the foam land that got torn up. In the beginning, when they didn't realise, they put a rabbit-proof fence around. They put a box-thorn hedge around, not realising what was ahead of them. Next thing, the reality set in. And it never rained properly till 1945. There was a good year or two, but then back to tearing winds and droughts and all the rest of it. And of course, then the drift, then by this time, that's what caught the aggravated burying the house. I got other photos there of the neighbour, the Gillick, came down one day, and he said to my father, he said, "Look at your horse standing on the roof of the little shed down the show." No. Well, he's on a sandhill between that shed and another store shed where the vehicles were kept.
As high as the roof?
As high as the roof.
So do those mounds then eventually, do they blow away again?
Well, I suppose what happened was my father spent a lot of time on those bad days just moving it a bit with a shovel, mind you. And then when the things got a bit better, as though hopefully it wouldn't happen again, as we tried to rejuvenate the country and not live on a square mile. They'd bought other little properties around, the survivors of us. And as things looked a bit better, then of course the horse and scoops got in and tried to sort out a lot of damage. The same with fencing was buried and one top on the other, and so they were shocking periods, tough periods.
So John, was that Craddock Homestead? Is that what you called Craddock Homestead?
Yes, that's Craddock Homestead.
And that was on 1 square mile?
On 1 square mile originally.
Right, and back then there were maybe 20 homes or so and a couple of churches, you said?
Oh yes, it was quite a town, really.
I went through there with my partner just last year and we called into the pub for a beer.
Yes.
And I think there's still only about 15 or 20 homes and they don't want to let it grow at all.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's never turned into, it was planned as a town. I could show you the plan of the whole place and all that. At a police station, I went to school. I got a sketch in there of me going to school in the police station.
Yeah.
One of the devilments of being at school was there were the cells there as well, and they had that little vents up the top of the cells. And the cells were just a plank to lie on and bolt the door and all the rest of it. But of course, once it became our school, compared with the old one that was a weatherboard show, when it was more like a town and when these hundreds of people were round about, there was a weatherboard school not far away. And that disintegrated, of course, and then they took on the police station as a school.
Oh, how did they?
Well, of course, being a devil, as I was apparently, and so was everybody else. Once recess hours came, be the temptation to see if we could throw a stone and hit the vent up top without it landing on the roof and disturb the teacher.
How'd you go?
So, yes, there's many memories.
So what was the income for your parents when you were born?
The income was practically nil because the droughts meant that, and even the droughts went on into 44 when I was at the privilege of being at college in Adelaide, by great sacrifice. And I was able to find the other day that I was lucky enough to help my parents to do so by winning a bursary that was £10 a year plus £5 for coming from the country. That £15 a year, it was the very year that the intermediate certificate went from 2 years to 3 years,
Right.
which meant a little bit more burden again. And so a lot of sacrifice was made, and then going back to those periods, any 2 bob that was made was going to, oh, God help us, sorry.
You're a popular man, mate. Do you want me to get it for you?
Well, if you just give it to me, I'll just be able to wipe them off.
No, you'll be all right. Answer it.
Thank you very much. Hello? Yeah. Oh, look, honestly, at the moment I'm on a podcast, Bruce. Well, anyway, sorry I can't help you at the moment, but if this afternoon suits you, I'll hopefully be round about. First of all, the heat wave of 1939. I still remember it, and I was 10. We talk about we got a hot day for 5 minutes now and there's hell to pay. There's a record. We've been freezing for 3 months into spring, and yet we're talking about having the hottest records we've ever had and all this sort of thing. We have about 1 day. I know Australia's a big place. I mean, it's a heat wave in Darwin while we're freezing down here because of the size of it. But the thing was, in 1939, I've got the records, I think it was 3 weeks over 100 in Adelaide. And the place was on fire everywhere. So, right, in 1939...
What's that in our temperature? How many degrees?
39, well, that's 100 and something rather. 37 is 100. 37.4, I think, to be precise. Yes, of course, old me was like pounds, shillings and pence. It's like I measure everything in feet and inches.
That's all right, mate.
I know the centimetres and decimal currency.
Yeah.
Yes, that's not too bad. Makes you feel as though you're wealthier, but doesn't purchase anything. My dad, in that heat wave, and we had that big old homestead, of course, and 1939, I'm 10. My next brother was an invalid, and then my sister, and then my youngest brother, Michael, who's taken on the Craddock country of latter times, was a baby or 3 or 4 or something, and my mother. And so the 5 of us had got measles in the midst of things. And I can see my dad still trying to care for us in the passage with wet rags over something rather to get a draft through to survive.
Yeah.
No thought about going to hospitals or doctors or anything. There was no, and if you went back to the Depression years, there were no handouts, no nothing. And I mean, hundreds of people, you can't conceive, they walked to Birdsville to look for shearing to find there's none there. 3,000 people left Robe with wheelbarrows to make a fortune in the goldfields. History just thinks, it's like the detail that interests me. We can get the detail now of who sneezed in my time. Look, if I go to the toilet, I take my medication with me. I take a water bottle in case I perish. If I leave the house for 5 minutes, I got medication in my car. In days gone by when we travelled around, you know, you had your swag, you had your tucker box, you had everything. My same grandparents took up 50 square mile out in the sand hills, out from Parachilna, and nothing on that at all. They built a 4-roomed concrete cottage eventually. They put a bit of a lean-to to it. They dug a well for water. And the relic of it is still there until recently. The 1980s big flood washed away the final identification, I believe.
They killed their own meat and grew their own veggies, perhaps.
Well, that's interesting, because if you go back to the Craddock block, it was so poor and so not having water, absolute desolation. But if I go back to comparing it with our grandparents going there to nothing,
That's right.
you know, yes, they dug a well 40 foot deep later on, but you don't do that in 5 minutes.
No.
They had tin containers sort of things and all that, but
Golly,
that would
how
only
did they
last a day or
survive?
two.
How did they survive?
I'd love to know the reality. And then they would have carted the stone, yes, all right, to say the slaty stones around in the hill country and all that. They would have had to put them in bullock wagons and things, even just to build the 2 slate stone rooms they did originally. Well, they've got to live while they're doing it. It's fascinating to fill that in detail.
So then at Craddock, though, how did you guys survive? There wasn't a lot of income.
Well, I suppose the thing was, when my father got married and took over from his father, the Craddock area, he inherited an old Essex motor car. All right, I remember that, canvas sides and all the rest of it. And by 1939 it got beyond repair. So he got what was marvellous in those times was 1939 he got a Chev utility. To be practical, if you had a utility, you got half registration. We could cart chaff and stuff because feeding basic horses and milks cow or 2 was your survival. And so that meant we could go to the railway sidings and get chaff and stuff, but it also meant that my mother, father, invalid brother and my sister sat in the front and Michael and I would always be in the back. It's hard to believe that vehicle did a bit over 1,000 miles a year, because all we could afford to do with it was drive into Craddock occasionally. Otherwise it was horse and buggies or horseback or something into my time. And the car rusted out.
Oh, no.
And finished up in a wrecker's yard in Jamestown.
Oh.
And so because I couldn't afford to drive it. 15 miles to the gallon. But I suppose when you relate that to today's efficiencies of various forms, but then when you think about paying $50,000 for a basic car, and then I was surviving the war as well. Mm. And I mean, the realistic fact is that there were big families, there were big debts. And my father's debt was to his sisters, and was very self-conscious about that and was never anxious to take on another debt situation because he was struggling to pay that off and very conscious of it always. So that meant there were no lollies and no anybody with a debt to a public company and wrote out lollies or anything on their basic order of food and stuff through their agent. Those sort of things got wiped off. Then the war came, and I suppose...
This is the Second World War now?
Second World War came, and then what happened was there was the fact that there was 3 or 4 brothers or whatever. 2 or 3 went to the war, and one was encouraged to stay home to produce food and so forth, and the land was the basis of everything in those times. And so it turns out that he took on the debt to stay home, and the others went away to the war. Well, the thing about it was it became very embarrassing because those that survived the war came home, but the one that stayed home and took on the debt and finished up with the property, all of a sudden when the boom of the 50s came, then the next thing is even in our own case, the first time we had an income worth talking about, then in came pay-as-you-go taxation. And our taxation bill was greater than our income.
Oh, no.
Because of the pay-as-you-earn.
Yeah.
That was so bad that the government had to repeal it, and I can't remember whether they repealed 40% off the pay-as-you-go or which way they went about it, but it was so terrible for everybody. I mean, there's never been another income like it, like percentage-wise. Yeah, there's bigger incomes now, but the point now is, yeah, we got bigger incomes on the land, but the cost of doing it is a killer. So we always sort of trying to find a balance, but...
You had 2 brothers and a sister?
Yes.
And did anyone go to war?
No, well, to finish up, the closest to us was, we were born just at the safety side.
Yeah.
I was at college during the war, and I mean, it was very, very Spartan. I had no pocket money, no nothing much. And then I was drawn into the cadets, made a corporal straight away, and I got photos of it and all the rest of it, and it didn't look too good. And I was allowed to go home for the holidays because I was on the land. But otherwise, you had to stay and go to camps for rifle practice and all this sort of thing. And next thing, out of the blue, the bomb dropped. And if I'll never forget, I wasn't much bigger, but I was very active and so forth. And we were allowed the weekend off. Just about the whole of the city flocked Adelaide at night. And I'll bet no one locked their house. I never heard of anything such thing as rape and plunder and murder and God knows what. Whereas today you wouldn't be going to go to the toilet without locking your house.
No. So how was that feeling for you, John, when you heard
Well,
about
it was absolutely unreal. People just went mad. And we're all in the same boat. They just hugged one another and grabbed one another and just kept moving around. And then a few days later, there was some sort of a formal march, and I went to it. I sort of imagined something like 250,000 people. I've kept a diary since 1972. Every day, even if I never went to bed, I wrote down something. Not a big one.
It was a good year, 1972. It was when I was born.
All right. Well, I'll just keep a little note each day. I'll say you've been here once, we'll say what time you got here and what I said and this, that and the other, just you came here. And that's been my lifeblood. And so this particular march, it was an enormous crowd. And I was staying in a hotel in Adelaide that my uncle was managing to wait to do my oral French by Christmas time at the end of the year.
You were learning French then?
Oh yeah, French, Latin and all that. Je suis ne comprends pas, mon Dieu.
Okay, what did that say?
That means I don't understand what you're saying. I forgot. We had to learn to do it a little bit verbally as well as written.
Yeah.
Latin was the hard one, and yet the basis of our English language. And I mean, if you went to college in those days, you were expected to go on and become a professor, a doctor, a chemist or something. All I wanted to do was go bush again. The sooner I got out, the better, because I loved the bush. And I read a book a while ago. I used to like reading a lot till I got glaucoma, and now that's upset me a bit, and I can't read like I used to. And so this woman, journalist, wanted to go to Western Australia and get stories like you about people. And her advice was, well, if you're going to do that, you need to take a pistol with you or something, what you're talking about. She said, no way. She said, I wouldn't use it if I had it. They could shoot me if they like.
Why did she need to take one of those?
Well, because people are fear-stricken. She's come from Melbourne. And fancy you're going to go out bush and you're going to meet all sorts and you've got no you can't just call the police or protection. You'll meet all sorts that'll probably shoot you or something. Is there fear, you see?
Yeah.
But to those of us that she wanted the realistic Aussie, like I suppose you're probably dabbling on it in a modern version.
Yeah.
So she went. So she flew to Perth, and she flew out to Kalgoorlie somewhere or other, and then she set off. And her interviews with these characters was fascinating, because they would have no notion of shooting her.
No.
But the last thing on their mind,
Absolutely.
they were loners. And when Darwin was bombed, and the sad part is, human nature being what it is, some fled, some that stayed became pilferers, trading on the situation.
Yeah.
Here's me, my realisation was, the bush won't kill you, but those plungers and those tough nuts that are left behind, they might make life tough for you. So my reaction was, I'd be happy to flee, because you'll survive in the bush, you won't get shot or whatever.
Yeah.
But
That's it. You're a true country man.
well, I suppose it was always in my blood as to, I don't call myself a true bushman that, well, I suppose when you go back to our poverty days and read in Little Craddock, there was nothing, only go into Craddock on horseback and get the mow, go to the dances, play tennis. Well, I didn't want to take it on. It had been hard to me. And I had this bush kink that it was wasting my time. It wasn't big enough. It didn't have enough diversity for the both of us.
What age were you here?
Well, I was getting towards 30 at the time.
Right.
And I was thinking, I'm not going to stay here longer than 30. I'm going to tick off somewhere. And it wasn't tick off to a factory or something. It was tick off to the bush, I didn't know what. But out of the blue, my uncle took on and got married and took on this extra 50 square mile, making it 100 square mile. Well, then, of course, he wanted to retire, and he was a businessman and wanted to be involved in life in the city and so forth.
So just so I understand, was that called Commodore Station?
Commodore Station.
Right, and we're talking 100 square mile.
Yes.
Roughly how many acres is that?
Oh, well, 100 square mile is 64,000 acres.
You went then to work on there?
My uncle came to me and asked me, would I like to manage Commodore? And I thought, well, the affinity that I had as a child and my dad and life, knowing all about Commodore as it used to be, I thought, well, my desire was to get bush. But I'm not someone who's I'm not Burke and Wills sort of bush. But I loved it, interested, always read about it, found those stories interesting. I thought, well, it's going to be a big challenge, because we used to say once you went over the hill out from Hawker, you went bush. Well, I had to forego tennis and a bit of football and dances, girlfriends and this, that, that. I'm going bush. And bush it was, because I wasn't married or anything. The place was run down, and his family weren't interested in it.
What did you see when you first went on there?
I saw the realisation that I certainly knew all of a sudden what it was to be isolated and lonely. But there's always a good side. I took the challenge on, and I was prepared to meet it, because I wasn't happy with the desolation of Craddock. So there's always a good side to a story, and because I was single, my uncle negotiated by going to the races in Adelaide with a bushman who knew about his nephew, who had been managing properties in the Kimberleys. And I won't go into detail, but his life came unstuck. And he and his wife and 5 kids were in no man's land down in Victoria. And he said that it may be an opportunity for them to be a married couple for me. The respect and affinity between the experience of that man and what it meant to me, and apparently what I meant to him, we spent 2.5 years like that.
At Commodore Station?
At Commodore. He never went off the property. His wife accepted his situation. The kids caught the train to go to school in Port Augusta. We had to break in 8-year-old horses to have good horse flesh. We had 700 or 800 head of cattle that were not cared for too much and needed branding. We had 4,000 sheep that weren't mulesed or anything. And the years weren't too bad, and we just worked day and night. And I'm left with not much experience of all this sudden change that I've taken on. But this man supported me very humbly.
And vice versa, by the sounds.
Well, he was the one that gave me the experience of breaking in these horses. He was the ones that gave me the experience of many, many things. We went through a shocking period of no wind. So we were day and night pumping water for cattle. And, you know, the engines and things were older than the both of us that had never been used much, but all of a sudden we got this pressure. Well, he had the experience to help me to remake these engines and get going.
So no wind, the windmills weren't working and weren't pumping water.
Yep.
And then what sort of engines replaced that?
Well, okay. When I say as old as us, the original Buzzercott engines become a collector's items nowadays.
Yeah.
I wish I got one because we got, with this man's help, I learned how to pour bearings and all sorts of things. And the knowledge that I got from him so humbly, I even joke about all of a sudden I'm lassoing cattle, I'm lassoing horses, because the bush was, I was just hitting my straps.
Yeah.
And I have to throw in the memories of, a bit later on I come to Swan Reach, but I won't break into that.
Yeah.
But the lassoing business, I go to Swan Reach and I'm the boy from the bush. And so I went down to my neighbour one morning, and of course I didn't even know where the Murray was till I bought
Okay, so this is when you're at Swan Reach?
Yes, but I won't, I'll just only throw this little story in at the moment. I'm at Swan Reach.
Yeah.
I go down to my neighbour. The river came down in the 70s, and because the control may come from Adelaide or Timbuktu, you might wake up in the morning, and this particular morning the barrage had been opened at Blanchetown and 2 foot of water, and so this man's swamp, where his sheds were, there's 2 foot of water overnight, and his petrol drums are out. Well, to be sensible, they'd easily be, you know, past my table there, out in the water.
8 metres or so, yeah?
Yep, and he's thinking, well, you know, he'd have to just about strip, and then how can he handle the drums to get in? I said, Frank was his name. I said, Frank, you got some ropes kicking around here, I'll bet. And I lassoed the drums and we dragged them in, dry as a bone. I can see the look on that man's face to this day. He'd never seen a lasso.
And you rescued
And the look on mine would have been good too, to think I didn't miss. Did one, and next thing did another one.
Well done. But you got that experience from lassoing, what, calves?
From this man, yes. And then he taught me how to make hide ropes.
Yeah.
And of course, we had hide ropes and it wouldn't cut your hands or anything. Yeah. So there's another thing. Yeah. Hands, if you wore gloves or did anything in those days, you were a pansy of the highest order. And I remember I spent 2 months on a plunge getting a dumping machine, getting rust out of a bore.
Yeah.
No gloves, no. My hands were, I was ashamed of them. And even now, if the chemist here some time ago wanted to test I got diabetes and all the rest of it, and he went to stab them and thought, hell.
Bit tough?
bit tougher than he's used to in the brother. But I mean, now I wouldn't blow my nose without gloves and roses and things, and you sort of think, but...
So you were lassoing calves to mark them, were you? Or what were you
Well, I
using the lasso
suppose
for?
I suppose what happened was, after I got going and sorted things out, it got to the stage of being a fairly organised thing, but we had sheep and cattle.
Right.
And the seasons weren't too bad at one or two stages. And so, with this man's background and that sort of thing, we'd lasso a calf, no, Mickey bull or whatever you call it, and we'd pull it up with a horse, not today's vehicles. And well, today they got cradles. You go up a cage, a race,
Yeah.
jammed in it and tip it over and land on tyres and do your job, and they're pinned down with a table on top. That's another thing we used to do when one of us would pull it up with the horse and the other one, and the test would be, you've caught the calf over there and you've got your hide rope that you're going to get onto one leg. Well, you don't wait till it's pulled up to the post and then put it on. If you're smart, you get it on while he's pulling it up, and boom, tied, it's all done.
Oh, there must be an art in it.
Well, of course there's an art, I suppose, and I mean, I'm not in the race compared with real bushmen and people that have, you know...
So going back to Commodore Station
Yes,
then, and you were breeding cattle and sheep.
Yes.
You had fences, and did you move the stock at water points, did you? Could you turn off water and move them to another water point?
Yeah, well, by this time the country was chopped into paddocks, big ones and little ones or whatever, and yes, we jiggled and moved around and that sort of thing, according to the season and so forth, and just grew with second nature.
Well, that wraps up part one of our conversation with John. And trust me, we definitely couldn't stop at just one. In the next episode, we'll hear about a 10-year-old boy lost in the Flinders Ranges, a long search and a devastating result. He heads to Queensland, where he works on an outback station, then returns to South Australia to marry the love of his life and buys the iconic Cooloola station. Be sure to join us for part 2 coming your way next week.
Salt of the Earth Farm Stories is proudly brought to you by Grig Media.